In the tobacco-rich valleys of Virginia in 1851, where morning mist clung to rolling hills like secrets to skin, and the James River carried commerce along with whispered rumors that never quite surfaced into daylight, there existed a social circle of plantation elite that appeared from the outside to represent everything refined and proper about Southern aristocracy. 5 families, the Sterlings, the Ashworths, the Caldwells, the Thorntons, and the Waverleys, connected through marriage, business partnerships, and decades of friendship, hosted elaborate social gatherings that were the envy of Virginia society and set standards for hospitality that others struggled to match. What visitors to these gatherings never suspected was that beneath the surface of quilting circles, literary discussions, and charity benefits operated something far more disturbing: a systematic network for exchanging slaves among the families for purposes that had nothing to do with labor optimization and everything to do with desires that Southern society officially condemned, but privately enabled through the absolute power masters held over enslaved people. In a single devastating week in October 1854, when a slave named Daniel escaped to Pennsylvania and provided testimony to abolitionists who understood the significance of what he described, evidence emerged of a 3-year conspiracy that had involved dozens of enslaved people, violated even slavery's supposed moral boundaries, and required the cooperation of county officials to suppress once the truth began to surface. This is the account of how 5 prominent families transformed property ownership into organized exploitation, how absolute power over human beings inevitably corrupts those who hold it, and how one man's escape finally exposed secrets that those families had believed would remain buried behind the elegant facades of their plantation homes. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that elite society worked desperately to keep hidden. The Sterling Plantation, Riverside Manor, sat on 3,200 acres of prime tobacco land along the James River. Its main house a testament to 3 generations of wealth accumulated through slave labor and shrewd business dealings. Margaret Sterling, mistress of Riverside Manor, 42 years old in 1851, and had been managing the plantation's social calendar for 2 decades following her marriage to Robert Sterling, a man 15 years her senior who spent most of his time in Richmond conducting business and left domestic matters entirely to his wife's supervision. Margaret was everything Virginia society valued in a plantation mistress: elegant, educated, accomplished in the domestic arts, and skilled at maintaining the social networks that defined elite Southern life. She hosted quarterly gatherings at Riverside Manor that brought together the 5 interconnected families, events that combined genuine social purposes like fundraising for church-building projects with the private business that these families increasingly conducted among themselves. The other 4 families occupied plantations within a 20-mile radius of Riverside Manor, close enough for regular visiting but distant enough that each maintained distinct identity and reputation. Elizabeth Ashworth of Ashworth Heights was Margaret's closest friend, a relationship formed during their shared education at a Richmond finishing school 3 decades earlier. Caroline Caldwell of Oakmont, younger than the others at 35, had married into the circle 5 years prior and brought with her connections to prominent Charleston families. Victoria Thornton of Thornwood represented old Virginia money, her family having held their land since colonial times. And she carried herself with the particular arrogance that came from centuries of assumed superiority. Finally, Helena Waverly of Waverly Hall, a widow who had taken control of her late husband's estate with uncommon business acumen, rounded out the group with a practical mindedness that the others sometimes found useful and sometimes threatening. The 5 women met monthly in rotating locations, officially to coordinate charity work and plan social events, but increasingly to discuss matters that they would never have raised in mixed company or in the presence of anyone outside their trusted circle. It was during one of these meetings in early 1851 that the conversation took a turn that would eventually lead to the network's formation, though none of the women would have described it that way at the time. Elizabeth Ashworth mentioned casually that she had been forced to dismiss one of her house slaves, a young woman who had proven unsuitable for the refined work required in the main house, and now faced the inconvenience of training a replacement. Margaret Sterling, perhaps as a joke or perhaps testing boundaries she had been thinking about for some time, suggested that rather than going through the expense and trouble of purchasing and training new slaves, the families might consider exchanging among themselves, temporarily loaning slaves for specific purposes, and then returning them when those purposes were fulfilled. What began as discussion of household labor efficiency gradually evolved, over subsequent meetings, into something far more disturbing as the women began speaking more openly about other purposes that exchanged slaves might serve. The transformation from economic efficiency to organized exploitation happened gradually enough that each step seemed small, reasonable given the absolute power these women held over their slaves, and certainly nothing that violated the social codes that governed their class. Victoria Thornton mentioned that she had a male slave who had caught her attention for reasons she didn't initially specify, but that the other women understood through careful silence and meaningful glances. Caroline Caldwell admitted that she sometimes felt confined by the limitations of plantation life, that her husband's frequent business travel left her isolated, and that she envied women in European novels who seemed to have more agency over their private lives. Helena Waverly, with the practical directness that characterized her approach to most matters, stated plainly that widowhood had left her with needs that society provided no legitimate means to fulfill, and that the absolute privacy of plantation life meant opportunities existed if one had courage to seize them. By summer of 1851, the network was operating with increasing systematization, though the women still avoided explicit acknowledgement of what they had created. A slave from one plantation would be loaned to another for a period of weeks or months, officially to assist with specific projects like harvest preparation or house renovation, but actually to serve purposes that had nothing to do with labor. The loaning was always documented in formal letters between the mistresses, creating paper trails that appeared entirely legitimate while concealing the true nature of the exchanges. Slaves were selected based on physical appearance, demeanor, and crucially, their isolation from family connections that might lead to questions about their temporary absences from home plantations. The system required careful record-keeping to ensure that no slave remained at a borrowing plantation long enough to establish connections that might lead to exposure. Margaret Sterling, whose organizational skills had made her the natural coordinator of the network, maintained a private ledger that tracked every exchange, specified durations, noted which mistresses had current loans and which were awaiting their turns. The ledger was disguised as a garden planning journal, its entries coded in language that would appear innocuous to any outsider who might accidentally see it, but that the 5 women understood perfectly. Roses meant young male slaves, lilies meant young female slaves, and various other botanical terms corresponded to specific attributes or purposes. The seasons marked duration of loans, and planting schedules actually indicated rotation patterns that ensured each mistress received regular opportunities to borrow slaves matching her preferences. By 1852, the network had expanded beyond simple exchanges between the 5 core families to include occasional participation from 3 other Virginia families who had proven themselves trustworthy and who understood that absolute silence was the price of admission to the circle. The gatherings at Riverside Manor took on dual purposes, maintaining their external appearance as respectable social events, while also serving as coordination meetings where the women discussed logistics, resolved scheduling conflicts, and ensured that no patterns emerged that might draw attention from husbands, overseers, or the broader community. The slaves who cycled through the network understood exactly what was happening, but had no means to resist or report it without facing severe punishment or death. And they knew that any accusation they made against white women of prominent families would be dismissed immediately and probably result in being sold away to the brutal conditions of Deep South cotton plantations. Daniel was 26 years old in 1851 when he first became part of the network's rotation. selected by Margaret Sterling from Riverside Manor's slave population for loan to Elizabeth Ashworth at Ashworth Heights. He was tall, well-built from years of field labor, and possessed a quiet dignity that made him valuable for house service. Despite his lack of training in refined domestic work, Daniel's selection was not random. Margaret had noticed him during one of her increasingly frequent tours of the slave quarters, had observed him with the assessing gaze she had learned from the other women, had decided he met the specific criteria Elizabeth had described during their last coordination meeting. Daniel was told that he was being loaned to Ashworth Heights to assist with construction of a new barn, a plausible explanation that he had no reason to question initially. When he arrived at Ashworth Heights, Elizabeth's overseer directed him not to the construction site, but to a small cabin near the main house, explaining that he would be quartered there alone, and that his duties would be assigned directly by the mistress rather than through normal plantation channels. Daniel understood within days what his actual purpose at Ashworth Heights was. Elizabeth Ashworth summoned him to the main house repeatedly, always at times when her husband was away on business or occupied with plantation management far from the house, always to private rooms where no other slaves or family members would witness their interactions. Daniel's compliance was coerced through the same mechanisms that governed all master-slave relationships under slavery. Refusal meant punishment or sale, and even if he had wanted to report what was happening, who would he tell, and who would believe a slave's accusation against a prominent white woman? Over the following 3 years, Daniel cycled through all 5 core plantations and 2 of the peripheral families, his labor never including actual work beyond occasionally performing tasks that created the appearance of justifying his presence. At Oakmont, Caroline Caldwell's plantation, he spent 2 months quartered in a former storage building that had been converted into surprisingly comfortable living space, furnished with items that seemed designed for occupancy rather than storage, and equipped with locks that could only be opened from the outside. At Thornwood, Victoria Thornton treated him with a mixture of imperious command and strange intimacy that Daniel found more disturbing than the purely transactional approach Elizabeth Ashworth had taken. At Waverly Hall, Helena Waverly was coldly efficient, making clear through her manner that she viewed their interactions as simple arrangements of convenience that required no pretense of emotional connection. Daniel discovered that he was not the only slave circulating through the network, though the women were careful to ensure that slaves from different home plantations rarely encountered each other during their loans. Occasionally, at Riverside Manor during coordination gatherings, Daniel glimpsed other slaves who bore the same quiet expression of trapped awareness that he recognized in his own face when he caught his reflection in mirrors in the main houses where he was temporarily housed. Once he encountered a young woman named Sarah who had been loaned from the Caldwell plantation to Riverside Manor, and in a brief whispered conversation in a hallway, while both were delivering items their temporary mistresses had requested, they shared enough information to understand that at least a dozen slaves were part of the rotation at any given time, all selected according to criteria the mistresses had established, all sworn to silence through threat of consequences that everyone understood would be fatal. The network operated with remarkable security for 3 years, maintained through the women's careful planning, their absolute power over the slaves they exploited, and the broader social structures that made accusations against white women by enslaved people literally incredible in legal terms. The mistresses understood that their greatest protection was not secrecy, though they valued that, but rather the fundamental nature of slave society itself, which granted masters absolute authority over slaves' bodies and made any claim that such authority had been abused into a non-claim, an impossibility that courts and communities would refuse to recognize even if presented with evidence. But absolute security was always an illusion, and systems maintained through coercion inevitably contained the seeds of their own exposure. Daniel's opportunity to escape came in September 1854, during one of his rotations to a peripheral family's plantation in a county that bordered free states. The overseer at that plantation was less vigilant than those at the Core 5 family's properties, and Daniel, who had spent 3 years studying security measures and planning, recognized his chance. On a moonless night when he was certain of the timing, he slipped away from his quarters and began the dangerous journey north, traveling by night through forests and along waterways, avoiding roads where slave catchers might patrol, surviving on stored provisions he had accumulated over months, and on his knowledge of edible plants learned during childhood. Daniel reached Pennsylvania after 19 days of desperate flight, arriving in a community of free blacks and abolitionist Quakers who provided shelter while he recovered from exhaustion and malnutrition. It was there that he met William Still, a prominent figure in the Underground Railroad, who understood the importance of documenting fugitive slaves' testimonies for future use in anti-slavery advocacy. Over the course of several long interviews, Daniel described the network in detail, naming the 5 core families, explaining the system of exchanges, providing information about the coded ledger Margaret Sterling maintained, and estimating that at least 15 to 20 different slaves had been circulated through the network during the 3 years he had been part of it. Still recognized immediately that Daniel's testimony, if it could be verified and publicized, represented exactly the kind of moral exposure of slavery's corruptions that abolitionists needed to counter Southern arguments about slavery's supposed benevolence and the protective paternalism of master-slave relationships. Still arranged for Daniel's testimony to be recorded in formal affidavit form and began reaching out to abolitionist newspapers and politicians who might be willing to use the information against pro-slavery interests. But before the testimony could be widely circulated, word of Daniel's escape reached Virginia, and the network moved quickly to protect itself in ways that revealed both their previous security measures and their willingness to commit further crimes to prevent exposure. Margaret Sterling received notification of Daniel's escape in late September 1854, and she immediately called an emergency meeting of the 5 core families at Riverside Manor. The women understood that if Daniel's testimony reached audiences that might believe him, particularly Northern abolitionists eager for evidence of slavery's moral corruption, the network would be exposed and their reputations destroyed. The solution they arrived at was methodical and revealed the casual cruelty that 3 years of organized exploitation had normalized in their thinking. Every slave who had been part of the network's rotation would be sold immediately to distant Deep South plantations, where they could never be contacted by investigators, and where the brutal conditions would likely kill them within years. The coded ledger would be destroyed, and all correspondence between the families regarding exchanges would be burned. The 3 peripheral families who had occasionally participated would be warned that any acknowledgement of the network's existence would result in social and economic retaliation that would destroy their standing in Virginia society. And, if necessary, the women would use their families' connections to county officials and judges to ensure that any investigation died before reaching formal legal proceedings. The mass sale of slaves began in early October 1854, executed through agents in Richmond who specialized in discreet transactions that left minimal paper trails. Sarah, the young woman Daniel had briefly spoken with, was sold to a Mississippi cotton plantation, known for mortality rates that made it effectively a death sentence. A man named Joseph, who had been rotated through the network for 2 years, went to Louisiana sugar operations that were even more brutal. One by one, every slave who had been loaned through the network disappeared into the Deep South, their fates unknown to families who watched helplessly as people they loved were loaded onto wagons and transported away. The destruction of evidence was equally thorough. Margaret Sterling burned her coded ledger personally, feeding each page into her bedroom fireplace and watching until every sheet had been reduced to ash. The other 4 women burned all correspondence related to exchanges, their decades-long paper trails of what had appeared to be innocent loans for labor purposes, going up in smoke during carefully tended fires in their own fireplaces. Within 2 weeks of Daniel's escape, virtually all physical evidence of the network's operation had been destroyed, leaving only Daniel's testimony and whatever memories survived in the minds of people who had no legal standing to testify in Virginia courts. William Still understood that without corroborating evidence or additional witnesses, Daniel's testimony would be dismissed by pro-slavery interests as abolitionist fabrication. The wild claims of a runaway slave coached by anti-slavery agitators to slander respectable Southern families. He continued working to find former network slaves who might have escaped to the North and could provide confirming testimony, but the women's mass sale operation had been devastatingly effective. Of the estimated 15 to 20 slaves who had cycled through the network, only Daniel had reached freedom, and the others were now dispersed across the Deep South in conditions that made further escape nearly impossible. The network's exposure did reach limited audiences through abolitionist newspapers that published Daniel's testimony in early 1855. But the impact was muted by lack of corroboration and by the broader context of sectional tensions that made each side dismiss the other's evidence as propaganda. Southern newspapers responded with editorials claiming that Daniel's testimony was obvious Northern fabrication, pointing to the lack of physical evidence and the convenient timing of allegations that perfectly served abolitionist political purposes. The 5 Virginia families issued a joint statement denying all allegations and threatening legal action against any newspaper that repeated the claims without clear evidence. No investigation was ever conducted by Virginia authorities, and no charges were filed against any of the mistresses involved. Margaret Sterling and the other 4 women continued their social gatherings, though the network itself quietly ceased operation. The risk of exposure having become too great even for women who had convinced themselves for 3 years that their absolute power over slaves meant they could act with impunity. The gatherings maintained their external appearance as respectable charitable and social events, and to outsiders who knew nothing of what had occurred. The 5 families remained models of Virginia plantation society. The slaves who were sold south, approximately 17 individuals, whose names and specific fates would eventually be partially recovered through later historical research, experienced a range of outcomes. Some died within months of reaching Deep South plantations, their bodies unable to survive the brutal conditions of cotton and sugar operations that worked enslaved people literally to death. Others survived years of suffering before dying from disease, exhaustion, or violence that was endemic to the worst plantations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. A very few survived to see emancipation in 1865, though freedom came too late to undo the physical and psychological damage of years in the Deep South's harshest labor camps. None of the sold slaves ever returned to Virginia or reconnected with families they had been separated from, slavery having achieved its purpose of destroying those bonds through forced migration and geographic dispersion. Daniel remained in Pennsylvania, eventually settling in Philadelphia, where he worked as a craftsman and became active in the free black community there. He continued providing testimony about the network when asked by abolitionist organizations, though his story never achieved the widespread attention that other slavery narratives gained. He married a free black woman in 1856 and had 3 children who grew up knowing their father had escaped from slavery in Virginia. Daniel lived to see the Civil War and emancipation, surviving until 1892 when he died at age 67. One of the few people who had directly experienced the network's operation and lived to tell about it. The 5 mistresses faced no legal or social consequences for their role in the network, protected by their class position, their family's wealth and influence, and the systematic refusal of slave society to acknowledge that white women could be sexual aggressors or that slaves could be victims of crimes committed by their masters. Margaret Sterling continued managing Riverside Manor until her death in 1871. Respected in her community as a model of Southern womanhood who had maintained her family's plantation through the disruptions of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Elizabeth Ashworth, Caroline Caldwell, Victoria Thornton, and Helena Waverly similarly lived long lives, dying between 1870 and 1889. Their obituaries praising their contributions to Virginia society and making no mention of the network they had operated or the lives they had destroyed through its operation. The network's brief public exposure in 1855 had minimal lasting impact on debates about slavery, overshadowed by more dramatic events like Bleeding Kansas and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry that captured national attention in the years leading to the Civil War. But the network's existence and the testimony Daniel provided contributed in small ways to the accumulating evidence that slavery corrupted everyone it touched. That absolute power over human beings enabled exploitation that went far beyond economic labor extraction, and that the moral rot at slavery's core infected even those who claimed to represent refinement, culture, and Christian civilization. In historical analysis, the Virginia Plantation Network represents a particularly disturbing example of how slavery's fundamental crime, reducing human beings to property subject to absolute owner control, enabled secondary crimes that arose from and depended upon that fundamental dehumanization. The five mistresses believed they could operate the network indefinitely because slave society had taught them that enslaved people were property without rights. That master's desires automatically overrode slaves' autonomy, and that social power could suppress truth indefinitely. They were wrong about that last assumption, but correct about the first two. And their exploitation of the slaves they circulated through the network was entirely legal under slavery's logic, even if it violated the moral boundaries that Southern society claimed to maintain. The testimony Daniel provided, and the fragmentary evidence that survived the women's destruction efforts, allow us to reconstruct enough of the network's operation to understand its systematic nature and the careful planning that sustained it for 3 years. Modern historians analyzing plantation records, correspondence that escaped destruction, and family papers from the 5 core families have identified approximately 17 enslaved individuals who were probably part of the network's rotation. Though the coded nature of the evidence means certainty is impossible, these 17 people became footnotes in larger histories of slavery. Their specific suffering notable mainly for the way it illustrates slavery's capacity to enable exploitation that went beyond even the normalized horrors of forced labor and family separation. If this story revealed something you never knew about the hidden systems that operated within slavery, leave a comment telling us what troubled you most. And if you want more untold stories that expose the full truth of American slavery beyond what official histories acknowledge, subscribe now. These stories matter not just as history, but as evidence that absolute power over human beings inevitably produces exploitation, that those with power will then work desperately to conceal. That social position can purchase silence even for the most egregious crimes, and that the only protection against such systematic abuse is refusing to grant anyone absolute power over another person, regardless of the justifications offered. Some believe the 5 mistresses deserve sympathy as women trapped in an oppressive patriarchal society who sought agency through the only means available to them, however destructive those means proved to be. Others insist they were simply perpetrators who used their racial and class privilege to exploit people who couldn't refuse them, and who then escaped consequences through family power and social connections. What is certain is that for 3 years, 5 prominent Virginia families operated a network that circulated enslaved people among themselves for purposes that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with desires that slavery's absolute power structure enabled them to fulfill without consent or consequence. That approximately 17 people were destroyed through that network's operation and its eventual concealment, and that the truth, despite every effort to bury it, eventually surfaced through one man's escape and testimony, insufficient to bring justice but adequate to ensure that history would eventually know what happened in those elegant plantation homes where refinement masked systematic exploitation and social grace concealed organized abuse.